Direct my first question to Mr. Eule, and it is this. In your opinion, what are the costs of implementing the Paris Agreement to the United States? And when I mention cost, I include the impact on jobs as well. Make sure your mic is on there.
It's difficult to say what exactly the cost will be, but it's surely going to cost quite a bit. When you look at some of the projections for reducing greenhouse gas emissions significantly globally, we're talking trillions of dollars, perhaps tens of trillions of dollars in costs. And the U.S. share of that would depend on what happens in the negotiations, but it would be a significant amount. Now, when you talk about the $100 billion that's supposed to be mobilized by 2020, that's supposed to be ratcheted up by 2025. The U.S. share of that is under negotiation. And there's a big discussion within the Framework Convention as to whether that should be government funding or whether that should be private sector funding or a combination of both. But I think it's safe to say that a large percentage of that will have to come from the government, and that will be money that has to be appropriated by the Congress, and it's going to run into billions of dollars. The impact this is going to have on the United States is significant. The United States, as I mentioned in my testimony, has an energy price advantage over many of its competitors, 2 to 4 times. We pay 2 to 4 times less than many of our competitors in the OECD. You know, if that competitive advantage goes away, I think we can see a lot of energy-intensive industries fleeing the country, as we're seeing in Europe. We're seeing in Europe steel mills closing. We're seeing petrochemical plants saying, companies saying they're not going to be investing in Europe anymore. We're seeing power companies saying they're not going to invest in Europe anymore. The same thing could happen here, and I think that's why we have to take a strong look at the big disparity in what the U.S. is promising and what other countries are promising.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Eule. Dr. Christy, NOAA recently claimed to great fanfare that 2015 was the warmest year on record. This is the same organization that claimed 2014 was the warmest year on record. Then when we read the footnotes, they actually said they were only 38% sure that that was the case. In regard to their claim about 2015 being the warmest year on record, what are the weaknesses with the data they're using? How good is their accuracy?
Well, this is a new data set that's come out and hasn't had much scrutiny on it. We've tried to reproduce parts of it and have been unable at this point. It's a strange kind of way that it was constructed. Relative to 2015, we have a better way, I think, to measure the climate system, and that's the bulk atmosphere. That's where the real mass of the climate system exists in terms of the atmosphere. And 2015 was not the warmest year. It was either second to fourth, depending upon which data set you use. So the fact that that information is not provided to the American public by a government agency is disturbing to me, because the evidence is there that 2015 was not the warmest year.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Christy. Ms. Groves, thank you for your strong testimony, and appreciate especially your history of the 1992 agreement between the Senate and the executive branch, and also the definition of agreement and treaty as the State Department itself has determined. And it is breathtaking to have a president that ignores this and abuses his executive authority, in my judgment. My question is this: to what extent are President Obama's promises at the Paris meeting legally binding upon our country?
Well, I mean, there are commitments made throughout the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a legally binding agreement. Just because it's not, he doesn't consider it a treaty, doesn't mean it's not legally binding. Executive agreements can be legally binding, like status of forces agreements, or even the agreement that we're working out with Iran on the nuclear deal. The important thing to note is that the other 195 countries certainly believe that the United States will be legally bound by its commitments, not only its commitments to reduce its emissions on certain targets and timetables, but mostly important for them to transfer billions and billions of dollars annually to the Green Climate Fund and other climate mechanisms that they're going to use in their countries.
What power does the next president have? I mean, is the next president obligated to enforce what this president agreed to?
Well, the rest of the world would certainly believe that the next president would be required to live up to the U.S. commitments under the Paris Agreement. However, since the president currently characterizes the Paris Agreement as a mere sole executive agreement, any incoming president may withdraw from it in the same way it can withdraw from other executive agreements made with other countries. There are going to be political consequences to that with our allies, but unlike a treaty, it's much more simple to unwind a sole executive agreement.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Groves. And the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her questions.